All right. Hi, everyone. It is 6 p.m. in Vienna, so we're going to get started with our panel about post-crisis lessons from Russia. I'm Stephanie Petrella, and I will be moderating this session. I am a fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute in Philadelphia, and I'm the editor-in-chief of B&B Russia and Ukraine, a daily newsletter about the political economies in Russia and Ukraine. So we have a fantastic panel of speakers today. First, we're joined by Sergei Guriev, who is a professor of economics at Sciences Po and a research fellow for the Center of Economic Policy Research. In 2016 to 2019, Sergey served as the chief economist at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. Next, we have Elina Ribakova, the deputy chief economist at the Institute of International Finance. Elina has also previously worked as an economist specializing in emerging markets at Deutsche Bank, Citigroup, and several other asset management firms. And then lastly, we have Sergey Romanchuk, the president of ACI Russia, the Financial Markets Association, and the head of foreign exchange and money markets at Metallinvestbank. So during this session, we're going to talk about the political and economic consequences of the coronavirus pandemic in Russia. From a public health perspective, Russia was hit really severely by COVID, in part due to the government's slow response. And today, Russia has the fourth highest number of total cases recorded in any country to date. Economically, Russia has faced a double storm of both domestic lockdowns and a collapse in global energy prices. And then politically, there's been a lot going on in Russia. Currently, in the far eastern region of Khabarovsk, there are protests that have been going on for several weeks after the arrest of the regional governor, and this is unprecedented in modern Russia right now to have protests that are this large. So we're going to cover all of this during our session today, but first we'll zoom back a little bit and talk about a few months ago, earlier in the pandemic. Sergei Guriev, from a public health standpoint, how did the Russian government respond to the pandemic, and what measures did it implement to stop COVID's spread? In economic terms, how severe were these measures compared to some of the lockdowns and quarantines that we saw in other countries?
Thank you very much, Stephanie, and thanks for inviting me. It's a pleasure and honor to speak here, especially together with Elina and Sergey. It's very hard to sum up briefly the last several months, but basically Russia was fortunate to have a advance notice, as Russia is now much more isolated from the global economy. Russia sends fewer tourists, and in that sense, the virus came to Russia a few weeks later than to Europe or United States. And Russia started to implement lockdown measures, which it didn't call lockdown measures, in the end of March. Then pretty much the whole of April was a lockdown. Again, it was not called lockdown by President Putin, who for some reason didn't want to call it lockdown, even though he himself implemented a very strict lockdown strategy. In terms of healthcare system response, Russia was kind of divided into two countries. One was Moscow, where the city government of Moscow spared no resources to roll out beds, ventilators, and essentially Moscow, even in the worst times, was not really overwhelmed by the peak load of epidemics. The rest of Russia responded pretty much in the way that a very poor developing country would respond, where they would just neglect the threat, and then in some regions they faced dramatic consequences. In many regions, we saw overload of the healthcare system by the cases. Then we didn't see that in numbers because, again, like in some poor countries, we don't have a lot of trust in the statistics. Overall, the numbers are not that bad. Russia has lost many people to COVID, and it's been a tragedy. By now, we are talking about something like 17,000 people who are registered in Russia as those who died of COVID. The reality is more dramatic. If you look at all excess mortality, we're probably talking about numbers which are 3 times as high, and in some regions 7 times as high. The epidemic is not over yet. If you look at the death curve, it has not come down to 0. It's been slowly going down since May, but has not actually dramatically gone down. In that sense, the healthcare response outside of Moscow was not great. Within Moscow, you can actually praise Moscow city government. Overall, there have been some mistakes. Moscow city government made a few, I would say, not a number, a few mistakes which resulted in outbursts. And I'm happy to talk about that if there are questions. But overall, Moscow city government has done a reasonably good job. In very short time, Moscow city government actually built new hospitals, bought beds, ventilators, and so on. Regarding the economic circumstances and economic response, Russia was facing also oil price shock. March was the month when the deal between Russia and OPEC fell apart in the beginning of March, March 5th, and oil prices collapsed. And there was time in March when oil prices were actually negative. And even Russian oil was traded at negative prices, adjusted for transportation costs. So the European prices for Russian oil were below the transportation cost from Russia to Europe. Now, oil prices by now recovered somewhat. They recovered to levels which are reasonably comfortable for Russia. But in March and in April, Russian government was extremely nervous. And when people like myself called on Russian government to be more generous, to support Russian households, Russian enterprises during these difficult times, Russian government was quite stingy. Initial government response, and this is something that needs to be put in the perspective of European countries or United States, initial package of responding to COVID was 0.3% of GDP. Later on, it was expanded to 1% and then eventually to 3% of GDP. Out of this 3%, the vast majority was actually deferral of tax payments rather than unconditional grants or conditional grants to firms. And in that sense, I believed then, and I publicly spoke about that together with my colleagues from Russia and from the West, that Russian government has to be more generous. Russian government probably was afraid that oil prices will stay low and the Russian government will just spend its sovereign wealth fund, which was and still is at the level of 12% of GDP. Could have done more, and it decided not to. And this is quite a puzzle why Russian government didn't use the sovereign wealth fund, did not increase borrowing. There is now a discussion that Russian government will increase borrowing. And that is a great question. My intuition, my response to this question is that Russian government is not fully informed about the hardships Russian households are going through. And Russian government also doesn't see a big problem in small businesses being wiped out by the economic shock. Because eventually this is not a constituency Russian government respects and cares about. And so in that sense, from the point of view of Russian government, things are not that bad. Yes, Russian economy will probably experience a recession. This recession will probably not going to be too bad relative to European countries because lockdown only lasted less than 2 months eventually. So Russian GDP will probably go down by 5 to 8%, depending on which forecasts you trust this year, which is, of course, better than forecasts for Western European and American economy this year. But overall, Russian government by now is pretty happy with its policy response. And as I said, oil prices have recovered. Of course, oil revenues are a bit smaller because the new OPEC Plus deal, which Russia concluded later, included cutting production of oil. And so while the price is at the level which is a break-even price for Russian budget, the volume is lower. And so the total amount of oil rents, oil taxes is lower. But that is not a big problem because Russia can borrow and Russia can also use the sovereign wealth fund to to pay for whatever deficit can emerge. So let me stop here.
That was an excellent introduction. I should mention that I forgot to mention earlier that if anyone has questions during this session, feel free to include them in the session chat, and we're going to leave some time for Q&A at the end. So to follow up on this oil point that you just made, Sergei Guriev, Sergei Romanchuk, could you talk about why the Russian government decided to withdraw from OPEC Plus in March, especially given that they rely heavily on oil revenue for the budget? And what effect has this had on Russian government finances and their ability to respond to the crisis?
That was the decision, which was very controversial and actually led to all the drama on oil market, because expectation was that Russia should stick with the OPEC trade, but it looks like the interests of some companies, and the media mentioned, of course, Igor Sechin, who is a chair of Rosneft, that his idea was to fight the American oil producers, American shale oil, in order to actually to put price of oil down for a short period of time, and to save the share of Rosneft and Russia together in all market. But as we saw later on, the price action was so dramatic that finally Russian government decided to take a new deal where the Russia experienced the greatest loss in the volume and the share of the market. So it was obviously a mistake, that particular action, but it had a very temporal nature. So after the dramatic price move, we saw that price stabilized, and of course the big picture was determined by the pandemic crisis itself, and of course the balance between supply and demand on oil market. But as a result, yes, we see that Russia lost some part of oil market, trying to increase it actually, or to protect what it had before. And of course, that was probably not a very good move. Market was surprised a lot because it was that decision, which was made on weekend, on Friday. Then it was a small price move, but when the Saudians decided to fight back, that was a price action on Monday, and that move probably was not expected by the Russian authorities. And then they decided, okay, like we can of course apply probably game theory in that, but no, not perfectly. And we see that actually the most loser was Russia.
Great. And so one thing that has been a big topic of debate during Russia's crisis response is the budget rule. So, Elina, you've said that you support the budget rule, which prevents money that goes from the National Welfare Fund from going directly into the federal budget. And so how would you assess the Russian government's response fiscally? Are they doing a good job at responding to the crisis and lessening its economic impact?
Well, I think they're overly cautious in their response. And I think this is a combination of sort of risk of sanctions and also oil price shock that we saw this year. And you've seen the European Commission has come up with, it's all geopolitical now. It has been geopolitical for a while between the US and Russia, US and China. And I think Russian authorities have learned that very well post 2014. So anything forecast-wise we're doing for the macroeconomic policy, we have to think, what does it mean for the geopolitical stance of Russia? How does it work together? And if you want to have geopolitical adventures outside, you, for example, need to have an OPEC deal, which helps you on the macroeconomic side, but also if you want to be sort of active in the backyard of Saudis, you need to have some sort of geopolitical macroeconomic project with them together. So this is one example. If you want to have adventures outside, you need to have your war chest that is stronger than strong. So if you look at the macroeconomic indicators, they're almost insanely strong for fixed income investors. And I think it started with a very simple project where they realized that the break-even oil price is very high post 2014. We still need foreign savings in order to be able to finance this budget. While we are trying to cut down the spending, at the same time, we need to bring in foreign investors with high real rates. And that then, by implication, leads to this very conservative central bank and Ministry of Finance policy. And that gives you buffers. And you saw the inflows back into the OPEC market compared to most of other international markets, apart from China. It was one of the soonest that foreign investors came back to Russia. So in a way, if you put this geopolitical angle into their macroeconomic policy making, it's vindicated. You know, they're accurate to be very carefully sort of thinking about their policy response. But if you look just at the domestic policy objectives, which would have been to support households, corporates, and the banks, less extent banks, you would probably need to spend more. And as Sergei and Sergei Romanchuk, of course, also explained very well, they spent only a few percentage points of extra stimulus. We've heard a lot about the numbers. We've heard 6.5. We've heard more than that. But if you look at the proper stimulus measures, you know, the change in the fiscal policy stance, it's only 2-3 percentage points of GDP. So they're extremely conservative. And I think that is sacrificing some of the domestic support with an eye with sort of foreign objectives.
So, Sergei Guriev, there's been this argument that a lot of people have been making that the National Welfare Fund, which is Russia's rainy day savings fund and has about 11% GDP, I believe, and it's been holding pretty steady at that point throughout the crisis. So there's been this argument that says, well, if you're saving for a rainy day, it doesn't get much rainier than a global pandemic, which is halting economic activity around the world. So if the Russian government is so reticent to spend this money now, what are they saving it for? What are their priorities here?
That's a great question, and I cannot give you any other answer. And I fully agree with you that, well, this is the rainy day, and so this is the time to spend. And the only explanation can be the one that was offered by Elina, that they want to have plans, geopolitical plans that we are not aware of, and for those plans, they want to have their war chests, and that is something that we can only, I don't know. That's the only thing we can think about. Overall, I think Mr. Putin is indeed someone who wants to be independent of the IMF. He believes that 1998 was the last time. He thinks that it should have been the last time when Russia asked the international community, international organizations for help, and so for being independent of IMF, Washington D.C. and so on. He wants to be able to be macroeconomically independent. But I fully agree with you. This is the rainy day, and this is what all independent economists said in March and April when we asked to spend this money to help Russian economy and people who suffer the most. Some of these things eventually, some of our proposals were eventually implemented. So Mr. Putin eventually returned some taxes to small businesses. So some small businesses got some help. The self-employed, the so-called self-employed, got their 2019 tax back. So if you're self-employed, there is a special judiciary status in Russia, and there is a special tax which was implemented last year, professional activity tax. So this tax was actually repaid back. 2019 tax was just given back to those people. And then Russian kids, people with kids, got 10,000 rubles per kid in May and then in June. This is a normal subsidy, normal, almost universal basic income per kid that was given unconditional to families with kids. But that was still, as Elina rightly said, very limited support of Russian families.
So as a follow-up question, in addition to not really spending its savings, another element of the Russian response that's been interesting when you compare it to a global context is that the Russian government has actually sought to increase taxes during this crisis. So at the beginning of COVID, during one of Putin's first addresses, he announced that they were going to increase taxes on deposits over a certain amount. And just recently, the Russian government also announced that they were going to get rid of their flat income tax and make it a progressive scale, so they hike rates on high earners. So obviously, you know, increasing taxes during a crisis is a bit of an unorthodox response. How do you explain this strategy?
So this is really weird. Both of those measures, increasing the top bracket of Russian income tax from 13 to 15%, which would bring Russian budget, by estimates of Mr. Putin himself and his Ministry of Finance, it will bring Russian budget $1 billion per year, which is less than 1/10 of 1 percentage point of GDP. And for that to create all this unnecessary tax administration difficulties is really, really strange. The other strange move is indeed to tax large bank deposits. It's also very strange. It's also not good time to introduce tax increases when economy is in a recession. But then on top of that, of course, if you want to make tax changes, they will only take effect in 2021, and the actual cash will be paid in 2022. So it's not related to this crisis. And the way Russia works, I can just imagine that some people had those weird ideas running around Mr. Putin and said, we are facing fiscal difficulties. What else can we do? How else can we raise taxes? And some, I don't know, deputy finance ministers came up and said, well, since Mr. Putin has given an economic speech anyway, let's shuffle in, let's smuggle in this great idea I have to tax depositors and high income earners. So it's really, really, really strange. And it's not rational at all. And something that goes against Mr. Putin's own legacy of first Putin's presidential term, beginning of 2000s, when he introduced flat taxes and lowered taxes in general.
If I may add something, probably my explanation is that it's similar to Sergey, that it's politically motivated, and the base of support for Putin, of course, switched from any business, and especially small and medium-sized businesses, to the general public, to the people who do not have large deposits. And why not? So why not to do if that will somehow help him to prevent his rating from falling down? So that's the only reason I see, because no financial explanation or economical could be found, I say.
Stephanie, one thing that I would like to mention, in those very same speeches, in the last economic speech where he announced moving away from the flat tax, he also mentioned one other thing, which is about taxing offshore wealth. And if you look into this detail, this statement, which was not discussed widely, he actually gave back to super rich Russians who hold their wealth in offshore entities. He actually reduced taxes for them a lot. And so this is not being discussed, but this is indeed a great representation of how Mr. Putin thinks about those issues. Like Sergey just said, he needs to take care of the majority. Then he needs to take care of his own elites, his friends who are very rich. And then people in between, the middle class, the upper middle class, these are the people who are not his constituency and whom he doesn't need to protect. He needs to tax them.
And I just wanted to add more. Exactly, this is a populist measure, which I think was also very misguided, especially on the tax on deposits. I mean, we're very fortunate that in this crisis, we're not having a financial crisis, and where it's absolutely kudos to the central bank, who's done a fantastic job. So a lot of measures were to increase lending. But there is no reason to generate a financial crisis by comments like this. And I think the authorities tried to back away from it, and it was clearly not a measure that was well discussed with the central bank. At least I hope, the central bank was not a big supporter of this. In the middle of the crisis, when you have a risk of runs on the banks, to be talking about the tax on deposits, this is the absolutely worst time. And I think also what Sergei and Sergei were talking about earlier in terms of the stratification of the population, and the measures. In terms of the healthcare response, the healthcare in the regions has been really decimated by the fiscal consolidation that we saw. Fiscal consolidation since 2014 started with regional spending. So regions have the allocation of responsibility to provide certain services, but if they don't get enough financing from the center, of course, it's very hard for them to do. And there were targets how to cut the spending. So as a result, we have a bit of a Potemkin village in the regions where people sort of get tested, they supposedly had COVID, then they get released, and it's all a bit of a sort of a make-believe. And I think it's easier maybe to hide it from the center, but I think the regional people who live in the regions, they can see it with their own eyes. And I think that is a big risk also to the popularity of the current government.
So, Elina, to follow up on some of the political motivations of Russia's government response to COVID, to what extent do you think it's been driven by the government's decision to push forward constitutional reform, despite the fact that the pandemic was happening? And just for context for people listening, one of the main amendments in these constitutional changes would allow Putin to run for yet another term and thereby potentially stay in office until 2036. So to what extent has, have politics, particularly surrounding this reform, driven their response?
Well, I think uncertainty, economic uncertainty with COVID, especially the dramatic contraction and synchronized contraction of the global economy, I think motivated this political change. I think there was a calmer external environment. The authorities might have been happier to keep the ambiguity for a bit longer. But I think this was a clear sense of urgency. If we're really going down very sharp negative numbers, and in March, you remember, we had no idea just how bad things will be, it's better to deliver certainty. And in terms of the external investors, for all the talk of democratization and the wonderful things, for a lot of portfolio investors, they prefer to have continuity in government. And I think that also played well for the external short-term portfolio investors. And for domestic players, it provided clarity. There is no room for squabbles behind the closed doors. But this is on the politics side. On the macroeconomic side, in terms of the pure sort of insulation from crisis, I think the authorities did a fantastic job, right? We have this fiscal rule that we talked a little bit about, and we also have very credible, very strong central bank. It's sort of the 101 of macroeconomics, which many countries don't get. But the next layer is much more complex, how to spend efficiently. And we've seen the fiasco, I'm sorry I said that, we've seen a disappointment performance of the national projects. Even if they were to say they're going to spend more, unless the projects that Sergei Guriev was suggesting to give cash to individuals, at least that's possible, other ways of spending is very hard to deliver well, especially in the regions. So that is a question. And another big question is improving growth. But not just growth. You could say, look, we're going to have low growth, but we're going to improve quality of public services, right? You might not have, growth improvement is easy to do. You build one project in the middle of nowhere, investment numbers and GDP go up. Is anybody happier? Is popularity up? Not clear. But if you find a way to improve, quality of services, especially in the region, well, your popularity likely go up, even though the economic growth numbers will not be that strong. But we haven't found answers to those questions, especially in this individual, somewhat isolated country. And I think we've tried that during the Soviet times, and it hasn't been very successful either.
And if I may add something, so about the voting, so about the new constitution, I guess that also authorities saw the window of opportunities in the changing of operational procedures, how to organize those voting, because that was the coronavirus was a justification in order to make this whole 1 week voting on that act, and statistical analysis of votes simply say that final results were falsified. It's similar to what happened actually in Belarus, because the political target was to get the majority of people voted for the new constitution, and it was actually not achieved by numbers. And those whole week, when the control of independent observers was very hard to implement, especially in the scale of the country. So that was the first time when, even in Moscow, the official results, they do not match to a very simple statistical check. If we compare even with the last voting on president elections or Duma parliament elections. So I guess that they just wanted to make it as soon as possible, because there could be no protest actions because of the pandemic, there could be no independent observers, and you can soften the strict procedures of Russian voting as it organized. So that's, I think, why.
And so, Sergei Romanchuk, to return to the topic of the central bank that was just brought up, given the government has had a pretty limited fiscal response, what is the central bank doing throughout this crisis, and how much of an effect can it actually have?
I guess that the central bank actually did a very good job. That's a very different story from, let's say, overall reaction, because they made, I think, everything possible. And they actually find the methods how to use sovereign fund, for example, so in a very effective manner on foreign exchange market, because they were quite lucky to have that trade with transfer of shares of Sberbank from pocket of government to the pocket of central bank, and that immediately led them to the situation when they could sell that about $35 billion on the market. So they had a capacity to do that immediately. And so they decided to, no, of course, not to do that immediately, but to implement the additional FX sales on the market connected to the oil price. So effectively, they made situation that if the oil price went lower than $28, that for currency balance on the foreign exchange market would be the same as the oil prices will stuck at that level, because everything which exporters will not sold on the market, central bank will sell. And that actually stabilized ruble a lot, even without the big amounts. If we compare to the previous crises, we see that the numbers, so how much central bank sold, it's much lower than in previous crises, but the volatility on the market and the currency rate, so it's stabilized. It was a very good job. And interest rates and the monetary policy response was great, because it was some moment of uncertainty at the peak of the crisis, because the general rule for emerging markets, if you don't know what to do, just hike the rate. And that was the lessons from the previous crises. But this was, of course, a very different from previous shocks. That shock from pandemic, it had a different economic nature. And as we saw, National Bank of Kazakhstan, for example, they made a hike. And so among Russian economists' analysis, it was a very nervous moment when everyone tried to tell central bank that please don't increase the rate, and so they made a Solomon decision at that time, keeping the rate on the same level. But later on, they decided finally to join majority of central banks in the world and to decrease key rate, and so in order to more stimulate economy and not to protect the market itself. And I think that was a very good measure. And if we are talking about the activity in commercial banking, of course, they helped banks a lot and helped the consumers a lot with all the easings in regulations, which actually led banks to restructure most of their credits to the populations, to the enterprises, and let's say that was very much in line with the measures of most efficient central banks in the world.
It's really interesting. So, Elina, how would you compare today's crisis in Russia to that of 2009 and 2014 in terms of the economic recovery that's to come? What are the longer term effects of what's happening right now?
Oh, thank you. I want to follow up on Sergei's comments in terms of the central bank performance. I think a lot of contraction in 2008 crisis was self-inflicted pain, and people don't like to talk about it in Russia. But this misguided idea, we're going to somehow manage ruble non-devaluating, but at the same time, we're going to spend 200 billion in reserves because we're providing a massive injection of liquidity. And we're going to have the commissars at some point. You remember, for those who are borrowing from the central bank, will be sitting on the trading floor and somehow we'll figure out where that liquidity is going. Money is fungible. You have open capital account. If you're blasting liquidity through the system and you're trying to hold effects at the same time, not going to work. You're going to spend 200 billion in reserves for various banks and hedge fund managers around the world who will say thank you very much and make money on that. And in the same time, your currency will still move. So a big chunk of that, if you remember at the time, we were still sort of targeting M2 supply, right? And it went from plus 20 to minus 15 in the course of 6 months. That kind of macroeconomic, the monetary contraction, what is it going to do to the economy? It's going to tank the economy, of course. So that's what happened. So you had a massive withdrawal of liquidity from the central bank position. And at the same time, in 2008, the new fiscal stimulus didn't come in till April. By that time, economy was recovering by itself. So I think that was a very much mismanaged response. Lessons learned, this time around, it's very different. You have flexible exchange rate, as Sergey was explaining. Volatility was much lower, reserves were spent on the margin only, and the economy, there was no financial stress from the movement in this exchange rate, and the central bank also could cut rates. So I think that's on the monetary policy side, it was a fantastic response. Also, what helped inadvertently is 2014, as Sergei Guriev was pointing out, has cut off funding to Russia in many ways. So our large corporates cannot borrow anymore because of the sanctions, right? So they already repaid that 250 billion of a short-term debt in 2014. So when this crisis shock came, they didn't have to repay anything because they're not borrowing much. The only concern was on the OPEC market, where we have seen some outflows, but again, the numbers there are just too small to matter. I think it's in a couple of, I think it's 20 billion or so. And maybe Sergey wants to add, in terms of the foreign participation, it went from 34% of the local market to 31% at the worst. And so it was not a big swing. So this crisis is different. On the other hand, what we talked about earlier, growth, we haven't found the magic recipe for growth and improvement of provision of services. And I think the political situation where you have very sort of pressed away, sort of pushed away opposition, makes the discussion on the objective way forward nearly impossible. In a healthy political system, you will be able to say, okay, this is our pension reform. And then the opposition parties will say, well, we disagree with you. Let's have an open debate. This is the best way forward. And the authorities could take some of that on board. And I personally thought the pension reform in Russia was necessary, and it was fantastic that we're doing it. But it got so politicized, and in the end, the authorities had to backtrack on a lot of things as well, that it's almost even the better objectives of this government get stalled because there is an echo chamber. There is no healthy interaction with anybody in the opposition on the macroeconomic ideas. And I think nowadays we cannot solve growth issues without a very open debate.
And maybe I also add something. If we look as a big picture on financial markets, so what happened in Russia, the capital outflow in foreign currencies was substituted mainly by the dollars and euros from sovereign reserve fund by the central bank, who sold that exactly the same amount on the market. On stock market, we see that was also very interesting thing, because so the capital outflow was substituted totally by Russian retail investors. That was a very new, stage of development of Russian securities market, because at the same time, all the retail brokers, banks, they already had very good platforms in order to get access to the market, and a lot of people switched their savings from deposits to the securities market, and especially interesting that they were buying foreign shares and substituted foreign investors. As already Elina said, Russia was very well prepared to this external shock, if we are talking about the foreign exchange in money market, because there were no FX risk actually in economy. So all the previous crises, they, let's say, clean up the territory, and FX risk was operated efficiently by all the market participants, and it was happened. What happened is actually effective de-dollarization of savings. So most of the savings of Russian general population is in ruble, and population didn't switch to the foreign currency during this crisis. So there were no purchases of dollars during this crisis, and even contra-cycle behavior. So that's, I think, like demonstration that lessons were taken from the previous crisis, and now we have much more matured financial market.
And to turn to the political consequences of the COVID crisis, so in early July, the governor of the Khabarovsk region in Russia's Far East was arrested on charges that he was involved in contract killings in the early 2000s. And this sparked really big protests in the region, where people are now telling Moscow essentially, get out of our business and let us elect a governor that we want. So Sergei, Guriev, do you think that it's a coincidence that these protests are happening during COVID, or does this fall into the broader global trend where we're seeing protests happening in the US and in Belarus, and they're in part also stemmed from inequalities due to COVID?
I would give a three-pronged answer. One is, indeed, there is a link between protests around the world, and this link is related to social media and internet spread, and actually have worked on this as a researcher. We have a paper which shows that the global spread of mobile broadband internet reduces, in general, government approval, and results in higher probability of electoral defeats of incumbents. And that is kind of normal that we see more protests in the last 10 years around the world, because even if you control traditional media, and especially if you control traditional media, if internet is not censored, the new internet technology, it's not the 2G or 2.5G, but it is 3G and 4G, which allows to share videos and photos quite quickly and check your social media right away. That actually facilitates protests and opposition activity in general, as long as internet is not censored. Now, I'm talking about second major drive. We talk about overall decline in approval rankings of Russian government and Mr. Putin in particular. Today, Mr. Putin's approval ratings are at the historic lows. So if you look at whatever measures of pollsters, approval rating, trust, electoral ratings, we see that Mr. Putin is his popularity is as low as it's never been in this century. And in this sense, we will see more and more protests everywhere. In general, Mr. Putin's economic stagnation of the last few years is finally understood by Russian population, that this is the government that either doesn't care about you or is not able to generate economic growth and income growth. So it's not just the COVID. It's general trend, which especially accelerated during the so-called pension reform that Elina mentioned, but then also the general lack of economic support. Unlike other governments, we said that Russian government was not generous enough to support people who suffered from COVID. And in that sense, we shouldn't be surprised that today fewer and fewer Russians support Mr. Putin and his government. Now, the third thing is indeed this issue that I mentioned before, the difference between Moscow and regions. And basically, after the protests in 2011, Russian government understood that it needs to make sure that Moscow provides a sufficiently high quality of life so Muscovites don't take to the street. And they've spent enormous amount of money on making life in Moscow better at the expense of the regions, or at least not investing enough in the public goods and services in the regions. And people in the regions see that and see this gap between Moscow and the regions, and they're very unhappy about this. And so it's not surprising that we saw Russian government losing gubernatorial elections like the one in Khabarovsk 2 years ago. And we see more and more rejection of Moscow-appointed governors by local voters. And then, of course, with Mr. Furgal, he didn't want to become a governor 2 years ago. He was elected almost by accident, simply because the voters hated the pro-government governor, which was in place at that point. And then he turned out to be a reasonably non-evil guy, and he just cared about people. And then when the Russian government said that he should be arrested based on his checkered criminal history, well, voters just didn't believe it, because suddenly Russian government decided to investigate him after 15 years. And during those 15 years, he served for 2 terms as the member of Russian National Parliament. And he was also a member of regional legislature. And at that point, nobody investigated him. And on top of that, of course, in Russia, you have statute of limitations. Even for very grave crimes, you have 15-year statute of limitations. So it's not really clear how Furgal can go to jail. On top of that, he was removed by Mr. Putin against the law. So in Russian law, you have this idea that president can remove the governor if the governor loses the trust of the president. And there is actually a list of 4 reasons when president can decide that the trust is gone. And none of that applies to Mr. Furgal's removal. So all of that is such a blatant violation of decency and law that people in Khabarovsk once again saw that Moscow abuses its authority and took to the street. And so we will see more and more of those protests. There are also environmental protests, like in Arkhangelsk region, where protesters actually prevailed. And also what they've done resulted in removal of the governor, not just defending their community against waste that would be brought from Moscow to their community. And then we just saw that in Bashkortostan, again, environmental activists prevailed over the regional governor, who initially was in favor of digging this important hill or mountain, and now he backtracked. And so that is not impossible to imagine around the country.
And a quick follow-up question to that. So earlier at the beginning of COVID, a lot of analysts were talking about how we're seeing this trend of the decentralization of Russian politics, because Putin essentially said, you know, each region is different, each region has a different COVID situation. So you regional governors decide how to handle this. We're going to give the regions the money, you spend it, and figure out what quarantine measures you need. Does the arrest of Furgal show that trend actually is not going to persist, and the Kremlin's going to try to take back some of this power that they gave the regions?
So I think overall, Mr. Putin is correct that Russia is different. Russian regions have different contacts with people who come from Europe. Russian regions have different exposure to the epidemics. And so it would be normal to have decentralized policy response. However, once you decentralize, you also need to make sure that people do have money. You mentioned that we'll give you money and you spend it, but this is not what happened. Mr. Putin said, you decide how to fight COVID, and we are still stingy. We will not give you money. And in that sense, many regions saw that and were outraged by Mr. Putin's behavior. And just to give you a magnitude check, so in February 2020, right before the epidemic, the approval rating of Mr. Putin, measured by Levada Center, the last independent pollster in Russia, was 69%. To date, 16%. So it's a huge fall. And probably it's even lower because during the pandemic, since April, those polls are administered by phone. And by phone, people are less likely to express disapproval of the government. So this fall is huge. And indeed, people have more affinity towards their regional governors as a result of COVID everywhere. If you look at the approval of regional governors, that has actually increased in the last few months. So that is something that that is probably the result of at least some governors doing a reasonably good job. So overall, I would say that Furgal's story is unique, but it also represents the broader trend. So Furgal's story is also important because a year ago, the vote against United Russia, the ruling party, was overwhelming in Khabarovsk. And so on top of the governor, who is not from United Russia, you now have a parliament where United Russia only has 2 seats because it only got 10% of the vote in the regional election. And then to add insult to injury, this constitutional amendments vote in July or June, depends how you count it. Khabarovsk also showed a result which was much worse than the average, probably because Mr. Furgal just banned falsification. He said, let's not falsify this vote counting. And so this is where the Kremlin didn't like that and decided to retaliate.
So we have a couple of audience questions that I actually would love to wrap together because they both really are getting at the question of how trustworthy the Russian government is. So Elina, the first question is, given that there's some questions about the accuracy of Russia's COVID stats, how can we trust the economic indicators? And for instance, inflation being low, can we trust those numbers? And then the second question is about Russia's COVID vaccine. And not only was it developed really quickly, but there's been a lot of secrecy around it. And I think to people in the West, it just sort of sprung out of nowhere. And so the other question is, what's the story with this vaccine and how can we trust it in the West, for instance?
So on the statistics, I think it depends which statistics you look at. I have much more confidence in the inflation statistics or inflation expectations. They also have business inflation expectations. Of course, they have level issues. Inflation expectations level has always been a bit high, and there's some inconsistency in that survey. But in terms of the broad trends, especially given that the central bank has done more work in terms of regional analysis of inflation, it used to be in the past when you tried to aggregate regional inflations, they never quite matched by an order of 10 to the average inflation from Rosstat. But now those issues have been resolved and I'm much more comfortable with it. But when I look at the real wages, that relationship to retail sales, I'm a little bit puzzled. That's harder now to explain. And so I think there's certain series are more manipulated than others. Again, compared to the cross-country comparison, especially, compared to Indonesia or China, you have countries which do much worse in terms of fudging the statistics than Rosstat and other authorities in Russia. On vaccine, it's very hard for me to comment because I think there is a breakdown of a bit of a global cooperation, including on this topic. We've seen a lot of sort of applications in the US as well. So there are a lot of there's 17 or more sort of tracks going globally. In a way, it's good to have competition, but of course, without an exchange of data and incentivization for vaccine from the budget funds, I think it's hard to see how we can cooperate on that front. And then just one last comment on the inequality. I think the protest movement and inequality is going to be a big issue for globally, including, for example, in the US, and decentralization, because the central government hasn't been very effective. You mentioned COVID, in Russia, but many other countries. And I think the sooner the government starts paying attention, the fact that COVID makes inequality much worse, and paying attention to people who are feeling left behind, the better chance they have in terms of keeping up their rating somehow. And there is a fantastic study by Carnegie and Levada about changes, and the fact that there is sort of foreign perspective looking out in, there's always, oh, but Russians tend to be they expect paternalistic government. And you look at that those surveys, that is not the case. There's sort of leave me alone, but provide me basic services, and that's plenty. We're not even expecting support. And I think on this basic services front, that's where we've been seeing failures over the last 10 years.
If I may add about the economic data, also central bank made a fantastic job with starting publishing the weekly paper on sectoral cash flows between the different sectors of economy. So actually now you have not only macro data but micro data, so you can see weekly what is going on in the economy. And of course the main reason, I think, to increase the trust into the data published. And so just have a look so you can monitor what is going on with Russian economy on weekly data. And every piece of that justified by the payments through the central bank payment system. So that's, I think, data you could believe. You could not falsify that.
Mm-hmm. So Sergei Romanchuk, to go back to Elina's point about inequality and Sergei Guriev's point earlier about Putin's approval ratings being at record lows, there's frequently an argument that's made that says that in Russia, the population tolerates a lower level of political competition because they have had their living standards increase greatly during Putin's leadership. And this has obviously stopped being true in recent years. And if you look at wage data, for instance, Russians today are not any better off than they were in 2012. And obviously this year there's been really large decline in real wages. So COVID is exacerbating the situation. So I guess my question is, to what extent should Putin be worried about this, given that, the sort of social contract of the Russian government might be falling apart?
I guess that we see that tolerance is very high, but I think you said that we had a dramatic decrease in real wages. Probably it's not the fact if you compare with the previous crises. We had the much more deeper effect in 2014-15 and in 2008 and 9 than even during this crisis. If you look at the overall on our personal incomes, and now you can see that actually retail activity is almost on the same level that it was before the crisis, and how they actually did that. I think because now economy is even more connected to the government activities, to the state-owned enterprises, and what a government actually did. They said there are the holidays. There is not like a lockdown when we pay you when the government pay you check, but they implemented all the companies, enterprises should pay the same salary, and only those small and medium-sized companies who actually saved all their personnel, all the payroll the same, so they could use the funds and the money from the government. So, like, I think that's still the demonstration of care from the government in the way that the people probably will not increase their incomes, but the quality of life will not go down rapidly. And that's enough for Russia. As we see this, the tolerance is quite high. I don't see that the only segment of society which is, of course, not happy and actually was very emotional during the crisis, owners of a small and medium-sized business, because so the government said, you must save all the working places, but we will not pay you any money. So you should find the right funds you by yourself. And that's the only segment which was furious, I think, during the crisis. But all the population, so I think rating, of course, overall decreased, but not dramatically, not to see a lot of people protests on the street.
All right. Well, on that note, we have run out of time. Thank you all for joining us today. This was a really interesting conversation. I've learned a lot from it. So thank you.
Thank you.
Very much.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you.